Okay, so while we're just waiting for more people to come on in here, welcome to everyone who's come. We're delighted you've joined us for the last of our this webinar series of 5, looking at bearing witness to the realities and consequences of war. In this episode, or in this webinar, John Lannon, who is an activist involved with both Shannon Watch, who trace the activities at Shannon Airport and military flights that come in and out of it, as well as he's involved with Doris, an NGO in Ireland, which support and promote rights of migrants arriving in Ireland. John will be interviewing Caoimhe Butterly, who has extensive experience in migrant supports, migrant rights. So this should certainly be a very interesting conversation. The conversation was pre-recorded because Caoimhe wasn't actually available for this evening. And on the recording, there were some little problems with the connection, nothing too terribly serious, a couple of little seconds here and there, but just to give you forewarning that you might see a few little glitches, but don't worry, they're very, very short. After the conversation, Mark Caravan, who lectures in GMIT and is the author of Compassionate Activism, an Exploration of Integral Social Care, he will respond to the conversation that we're all about to hear and give his thoughts on any points that came up that particularly interested him. And then just to finish off, because the event or the conversation was pre-recorded, we probably won't have a question and answer section because it's difficult for us to answer on anybody else's behalf. Nonetheless, the chat box is still there, so feel free to comment and interact, and don't be shy, of course. So without further ado, let's listen to John Lannon and Caoimhe Butterly.
Good evening, everyone. This is the 5th in the World Beyond War webinar series. The title of the series is Bearing Witness to the Realities and Consequences of War. I'm John Lannon. I'm an activist with Shannon Watch, who monitor US military use of Shannon Airport. I'm also actively involved with an organization called Doris in upholding and protecting the rights of asylum seekers, refugees and migrants in Ireland. I'm delighted to be joined this evening by Caoimhe Butterly, who's an inspiring campaigner, educator, filmmaker, therapist, and much more. And she's spent over 20 years working in humanitarian and social justice contexts. We're recording this 2 days ahead of the webinar itself, as Caoimhe isn't available on Wednesday evening, but I'm very glad that you're here with me this evening, Caoimhe, to share some reflections and thoughts. So we'll go straight into it. You're in Palermo in Sicily at the moment. You're at the end of a long, busy day, I know, but maybe you'd start by telling us why you're in that part of the world now.
Thank you, John, and thank you for having me as part of these webinars. I look forward to seeing them all. I'm, as you said, in Palermo, in Sicily, in the process of participating and facilitating trainings that are trauma informed and sort of resilience rooted for search and rescue personnel, responding to 30,000 over the past 10 years deaths of people, of families and individuals, of children and elders and everyone in between, making refuge-seeking journeys across the central Mediterranean. And in the absence of safe passage, the absence of humanitarian corridors, of the absence of regularized ways in which people fleeing wars and conflicts and persecutions, sometimes economic precarity, livelihood depletion due to climate change, resource-based conflicts, sexual gender-based violence, etc. In the absence of safe, in Europe, people continue to cross the sea. And in the absence of a coordinated response on an EU level to boats in distress, to people in distress, solidarity networks across Europe, for those of you who are listening outside of the continent, have mobilized a volunteer sometimes and an NGO search and rescue response. So part of the reason we're here is for many of us who have sort of participated in this solidarity and accompaniment work over the past decades, what we've witnessed, as well as sometimes, oftentimes, a real vacuum of mental health and psychosocial supports for people in refugee camps and on the way making their journeys. We've also witnessed a lack of that resourcing vis-a-vis people responding. So first responders, medics, ship crews, volunteers, activists, educators, social workers. So a lot of people from across the continent and further abroad who come to contexts such as Sicily, such as Lesbos in Greece, Calais, try and be there as both a solidarity presence and oftentimes with very practical skill sets, oftentimes have very little support. So part of our presence here is to try and respond to that and to begin necessary conversations around burnout and rust out, around secondary trauma, around some of the grief involved, the loss involved in bearing witness, in a really interesting emergent sort of concept amongst a lot of humanitarian responders of moral injury. What does it mean in a context in which there is profound injustice and negation of rights? And how do we keep ourselves well within that? How do we keep ourselves balanced and regulated to be able to respond with urgency, but also to be able to self and collectively resource ourselves within that work, and to do so from a place of more internal safety and more psychological and emotional sustainability as well. So how to keep on keeping on, but in a way that is, just more integrative, more holistic, and more real, with the vulnerability and fragility of, no matter how brave and tenacious and capable a lot of responders are, but that there are limits of those. Because burnout is a very isolating experience, and I've personally witnessed far too many people navigate quite lonely territory. And I think there's ways of really, just trying to mitigate against that. And part of that is, just recognizing, people's capacity and how that can contract, but also expand, I think when resource. Long-winded answer, but here on the shores of the Central Med.
Really interesting, and it often strikes me, that for those of us that are involved in different ways in different types of activism or solidarity, our capacities vary, and they vary from time to time, but they vary from person to person as well, and it's something that we always have to be aware of. We have to be mindful of that. We'll come back to some of what you touched on there as we go along, but if I may go back to some of your solidarity and accompaniment work that you mentioned. I know you and I have met at various times in various places over the years, and I think the last time that we met was in Galway when you were with a group of Zapatistas from Chiapas in Mexico who were visiting Ireland. And I know you have very deep connections with Chiapas going back over a few decades. And you've also stood with Palestinian people blocking Israeli Defense Force tanks. You've borne witness in Haiti and Guatemala, Iraq, Lebanon, and as you mentioned there earlier, refugee camps around Europe as well. So a lot of your life has been dedicated to solidarity with people living through oppression and conflict and displacement. What are some of your reflections on the journeys that you've accompanied people on? What are some of the common themes that are presented in the communities that you've spent time with?
It's a good question. And oftentimes I'm very loath in a way sometimes to give the sort of the sometimes I think a lot of representation or reflection about communities exists on sort of binaries, either or quite sort of reductive understandings of vulnerability. And I suppose what I witness continually in communities that I've lived amongst is that, people's lived experience of war is both subjective and individual. There are the collective themes, right, in terms of external dislocation and internal dislocation. So people, forced to become internally displaced peoples, or asylum seekers, or refugees, or undocumented sometimes in that journey, face that movement across borders, but also face like this huge struggle, I think, in terms of how do you keep cohesive self intact,
we might pause for a second there, if you don't mind, because the audio has just gone a bit poor.
Oh, yes.
Probably now it'll be fine again. It's actually fine again. I'm sorry to have interrupted your flow, but if you don't mind, going back again a sentence or two and continuing.
No problem. So back to what point would be good? Like, do you think the beginning?
No, just wherever suits you to pick up the flow is fine.
So for me, the difference between some of those communities and geographical contexts mentioned, the Zapatistas and Chiapas, indigenous communities that I've worked alongside in Guatemala, and then sort of refugee communities in various different iterations, is that thing of staying home, is that thing of sort of constancy, of being able to have that time and space with all of the challenges, with all of the threats of paramilitary violence, etc., but to be able to build alternatives, to really root them, such as the Zapatistas have done, in terms of, an autonomous being, a project that has really, reached towards a very different iteration of possibilities of future, for emergent generations in Chiapas, an autonomous healthcare system, an autonomous education system, self-sufficiency vis-a-vis the land, and a really quite profound reshaping of what does governance, what does sort of radically rooted vis-a-vis accountability, transparency, community, an emancipatory politic, what does it mean to do things radically differently? And then I think, that other part of the sort of the spectrum of people that I'm thinking that I've spent time amongst are people who have to leave their land, have to leave sometimes the projects of building those alternatives, have to leave, quote unquote, normal lives, lives maybe where they weren't engaged in justice, were caught up in conflict that has come to define, their lives, such as is happening in Ukraine now to so many people fleeing that conflict, that context, in terms of endurance, definitely I think physical, psychological, emotional, but also around joy. And I think that's oftentimes an under-articulated aspect of a lot of this work, for a lot of us engaged in this work, that for all of the grief, for all of the loss, for all of, the continual witness of injustice, we also have the profound privilege of being with communities, I think, in their times of adversity and struggle and grief, but also I think in terms of their times, of beauty and creativity and joy and community, of gatherings around food, around culture, around music. And it's not in any way to diminish, the immense suffering that people navigate. But it is to say that I think I can think of nobody that I've spent time with over the past, over 2 decades that wants to be defined by their vulnerability or their suffering. People are complex, beings, and there can be multiple parts of themselves, that exist with the war. And that is one thing that I've had articulated to me in so many languages, but I'm thinking particularly in Arabic over the past years of working, in camps with Syrian refugees who are so adamant that their country will not only be defined in the popular sort of international imagination, or understanding by images of bombed out buildings, and massacre, and dispossession and exile, and the amount of photos, almost as proof, of a beautiful country, with beautiful memories for people pre-war, that they're very determined that they will rebuild. So yeah, I'd say my main themes are courage, but also just that beautiful, I think, restoring, re-narrating, and almost subversion of these very reductive categories, that oftentimes exist in those of us who witness war or who witness suffering or who witness oppression. That people refuse to be defined by it, that their lives are much broader and deeper, than just the summative, sort of translation of their suffering.
Yeah. And I think it's so important to remind us about, the courage and the beauty and the endurance and the joy, as you say, that's in every context and with everyone. And I am often struck by, the pride that people take in the place that they have come from and what went before, despite the fact that it was, the oppression or persecution or decimation of the land by those who should have been protecting it that drove them from it. Yes, so you also mentioned displacement, of course, and grief and trauma. And refugees and other forcibly displaced people are exposed, of course, to multiple traumatic experiences and events in the context of war and persecution. And they're often prolonged, they're often repeated, they stay with people, they're intergenerational. Could you talk a little bit more about that and some of the traumas and the impacts that you've borne witness to over the years?
I'm thinking as you asked that question, John, of Ukraine specifically, in these weeks, both in terms of, the immense, I remember when invited to participate in this series, thinking, vis-a-vis like how I would frame my understanding of war, as well as, the cynical geopolitic and the arms industry and those who profit, and but as trauma, because my own personal lived experience of war is definitely so interwoven with profound, visceral trauma. But vis-a-vis Ukraine, I think I've certainly witnessed, and here in Palermo, actually, I've been interfacing through a social, sort of solidarity network here with folks recently arrived from Ukraine here in Sicily as well. Some of them just a few days ago, and spending even, brief time with them, it just really reminded me of the trauma that people carry and the trauma, that Ukraine is eliciting or triggering in so many other contexts in which people have lived or survived trauma, lived or survived war. And I'm here specifically of other refugees, witnessing the very racialized response, in vis-a-vis the European Union, when people from other geographic origins, such as Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Congo, Eritrea, et cetera, remain in these containment camps in states of limbo, in sub-zero conditions in the Polish, or no person's land. That it just feels like it's this continual repetition of something that we know inherently is so brutal, and as you said, so intergenerational, and yet it keeps on happening, and specificities, I think, of like all of these different contexts of profound brutality. It just feels like a language that is so archaic on so many levels, in this time, that there's this cyclical return, to this green lighting of just the most profoundly violent language that decimates communities. So the intergenerational piece, I was looking at images from Ukraine, and in a way how they mirror images from Syria, how they mirror images from Afghanistan, from a multiplicity of different contexts of families torn apart. And specifically, I was reading, that article about the father whose wife and teenage son and 9-year-old daughter who had that connection with the US vis-a-vis their work. But in a way, having, through experiences whereby I've witnessed how those impacted violently replay those split-second decisions. And that's, I think, where moral injury comes into it over and over and over, to leave that decision in the case of that grieving father and husband, to care for his own mother, to mind her, to try and keep her safe. And that family, the obliteration of a family, and then that intergenerational piece. And so when I think of sort of a lens of trauma, vis-a-vis so much of this, and I was speaking to a group of educators earlier online who are trying to respond to the many Ukrainian children, thankfully, without so many of the normal bureaucratic impediments to accessing protection, to accessing safety, are being welcomed to Ireland at the moment. But they were speaking about this consciousness of children coming into a classroom space, oftentimes with so little, resourcing and support. And what really I was trying to, if anything, reflect back to them, was as long as they can create that sort of warm space of a feeling of safety, a bodily sort of felt feeling of safety, even if they don't have therapeutic supports or counselors or the amount of resourcing that they should as educators trying to respond to those fleeing war, that on a level of the autonomic nervous system, on a level of, that traumatic activation that those children are navigating. And sometimes that might be expressed as, what could be categorized as sort of acting out, of distress, of overwhelm. But as long as, there's that sensing in, I think, to that space, that's a good first step. And when I spoke earlier in the conversation about a trauma-informed lens, that's what I mean. It's not that everybody, has to become completely literate in this language. I think a lot of people feel imposter syndrome around, sort of delving into more psychotherapeutic realms or psychoeducational. But I think as long as we begin to remember, at the very baseline, sort of basic, that we live in a body, and that it's not just our mind, it's not just a cognitive process, it's not just our mind that is processing information and traumatic incidences, it's our bodies and it's our nervous systems. And I feel, the most, I think, resonant, sort of attuned responders to refugees that I've witnessed, volunteers, activists, medics, workers, things, I think I've intuitively understood that, that low and slow approach, that when people are in a state of high activation, high stress, high triggers, just trying to create that space with the prosody of our voice, with our energy. I'm going to use sort of a vague term, part of it. But it just feels, again, that we're back in this cyclical loop, post a global pandemic, post this whole international conversation, obviously the hypocrisies of it, were illustrated quite soon on into that pandemic vis-a-vis vaccine rollout in the global south. But just after this whole conversation around, more solidarity and compassion and empathy and understanding of our own fragility, vis-a-vis our mortality, how short life is, and a war, another war. It's just, it's so tragic. and so anger inducing, that yeah, just this politics that completely disregards, the beautiful lived life of that 18-year-old, of that 9-year-old, of their mother, of the woman and her baby who died, 2 nights ago, of, the thousands and thousands of other lives. And then that interjection that all of their families, will be impacted for, in the decades to come is, yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, and bleak.
Yeah, and we come back to that maybe in a moment, but as human beings, our instinct or our default positions should be to be empathetic. It should be to be sensitive to trauma. And we do, of course, need some tools to embed that in what we do, but a lot of the disruption that's happening and the violent disruptions that are happening around the world, throw that upside down, and the stress that people find themselves coping with in their own lives, whether it's through austerity or it's whatever that the government or that society is thrown at them, it becomes difficult to show that empathy. Going back to the education side, you're also a filmmaker, and I went back today just to look at a small piece that you made about 5 years ago, I think it was it Refuge? And that was reflections of people that were stuck in what you described as an indefinite limbo in the Vasilika refugee camp in northern Greece. And a lot of what the themes or what you've just spoken about now were there. They were in that, they talked about their journeys. They talked about their hopes. They talked about their frustrations. They talked about injustice, lack of humanity and freedom. There were several generations there. They were fleeing wars. And they talked about how the experience of living in a tent in the camp had changed them. And we spend a lot of our time, we're creating sort of violent worlds, we're helping to create the conditions that people have to flee from by producing and supplying so many weapons. And now Europe is responsible for the unjust conditions that people like those families are forced to live in. What do you think, and it's happening on a grand scale, but what do you think our response as activists or as witnesses or just as ordinary people should be?
I'm glad that you referred to just that brief, sort of vignette or glimpse of that camp, because I haven't watched it in a while, but I was thinking back to one of the protagonists, or one of the young people that we interviewed as part of it, who was Hassan from Damascus, and the other interviews we had all done in Arabic, and I speak Arabic, but I purposely interview in Arabic because I think sometimes that the nuance, the emotional sort of register that we all feel when expressing ourselves in our first language is more depth. But Hassan was very adamant that he was going to be interviewed in English because he said that he wanted the words to sort of impact people, in English, not through subtitles, and he was amazingly competent speaker, but he self-taught. But he, I don't remember in this, there was a segue from what you said, but he said basically for all of those people who said, people who said that we don't want refugees here, meaning that xenophobic swing to the right that was very evident around that time, post-EU-Turkey deal. But so he said, for all those people who say that they don't want refugees in their countries, I say to them, tell your governments to stop sending weapons to my country, and then I wouldn't be here if there wasn't war in my country. And in a way, I don't think it's quite as simplistic as that, vis-a-vis there are lots of other, totally valid reasons of leaving, countries of origin, and, whether that's persecution, whether that's economic precarity, et cetera, but in the specific of that case, it made total sense, particularly then, because it felt like everybody had a hand in Syria, in an extremely destructive way in terms of, both regional and broader global politics, geopolitics. But in terms of a response, I've both shared, I think, the dismay, maybe, vis-a-vis the very racialized response in terms of this this conversation of compassion around Ukraine not also being, enveloping all of the other folks that we know. I'm thinking of the Kurdish and Yazidi survivors and their families still camped out, in the forest between Poland and Belarus. I'm thinking of people, as you mentioned, John, in containment camps, throughout different parts of Europe, or that, not containment camps, but that policy of containment and externalization of borders. But I also, along with that, so I'm holding that dismay in the overt racism, oftentimes, vis-a-vis people trying to cross from Ukraine to Poland, students from Egypt and Nigeria, et cetera, being, and workers being violently pushed back into Ukraine. The total, hypocrisy and double standards oftentimes of, countries that have been violently hostile to the presence of refugees. I'm thinking in parts of the Balkans, the present right-wing government in Greece, etc. So I'm holding that contradiction, but probably because I'm an eternal optimist, not always to my favor, I'm also holding a lens of maybe, just maybe, this opening of compassionate, humane response that is being exhibited. I'm thinking, in our case, in Ireland, the people fleeing Ukraine, that maybe that lens can be widened, to welcome people from lots of other geographic contexts, who are also experiencing and violence. And even if it can't for now, I think it sets a precedent for when we go back, and the years that we've all spent as campaigners and doggedly, knocking on that door of power, trying to up quotas, trying to tweak things, trying to get, 78 additional kids from Calais, or, a campaign call for 400 people, from Lesvos following the fire there in Moria refugee camp, 40 people, which, yes, was better than nothing. But what we've been shown now is it can be done. It can be done. That policies can change, they can pivot, they can respond to urgency, that departments and institutions and civil services can be mobilized, to do the amazing kind of work that has been done over the past 2 weeks in Ireland and other countries. So I think there's two openings, one on a, potential advocacy and campaigning level, that we can't be told that it can't be done in the future, because it can. And two, on a level of civil society, because for whatever reason, and I know we can put the racialized frame around it, definitely, which I think is a very existent one, vis-a-vis people's feelings of proximity to people fleeing Ukraine. We can critique that and hold that with grief, that can't extend sort of further. But I don't think that's cemented in stone. I know as a parent, I've always felt, maybe just because my life experience has been very out of the box, of your normal sort of school gate conversation, that I enjoy interactions with other parents because they're oftentimes lovely and very solid, compassionate people. But sometimes I feel dissonance of, listening to conversations about, sort of, Middle Ireland, but not quite participating in them, and my mind being in the war or, et cetera, somewhere else. But I have so many parents coming up to me over the past couple of weeks at the school gate, at pickup time, sort of saying, we hear that you work with refugees. What can we do? What can we do? And, seeing genuine, grief that people are holding around what they're witnessing through their television screens. And soon, what they'll be witnessing vis-a-vis those conversations in their communities, children in classrooms, people working, places of convergence. So yeah, I think it feels like, a time of enormous loss and suffering. And perhaps with that in parallel, a time hopefully of empathy widening, and that the urgency of a world that is so profoundly unequal, beginning to register on a deeper level with people, and hopefully consequent action from that. We live in hope.
We live in hope, absolutely, and we hope that, you know, some of that compassion, which is genuine with so many people when they see what's happening in Ukraine, we hope that some of that filters up to government level and to intergovernment level in the EU as well. And I'm just very mindful of the fact that we've just finished helping scores of people from Afghanistan who are living in Ireland who want to avail of the Afghan admission program that the government opened a couple of months ago. And they limited the number of places to 500 on that. And meanwhile, you know, we have talk of up to 100,000 people from Ukraine arriving in Ireland. And we hope that everybody who has to flee from Ukraine finds sanctuary, finds security wherever they choose to land. But we also have to find ways to extend the compassion, as you say. You know, we have to look at direct provision here in Ireland. You know, we have to look at what Frontex are doing in the Mediterranean. You know, EU investment in technologies to monitor migration along the borders now. You know, tens of thousands of people being forced back to Libya. You know, there are so many ways in which we have to reflect now on what our response to Ukraine has been.
Yes, and not allowing, you know, what has been a much better response to Ukraine, you know, vis-a-vis the humanitarian angle, you know, and receiving of people fleeing. But I think to act as sort of a cover or watching, you know, of Frontex, of violent pushbacks, of, you know, over 30,000 deaths at sea, of hostile environments, you know, of highly racialized, you know, militarized border policies. And in a way, you know, I'm thinking specifically as you referred to all of our friends and comrades in direct provision, you know, within a week, that one-stop shop at the airport, you know, PPS numbers, right to work, you know, all of those things, you know, that people like organizers in the movement of asylum seekers in Ireland, for those listening to this, Massey, of you know, in Doris, of a multitude of other organizations, grassroots networks, solidarity groups, who safety, the possibility, so many people that I've spoken to, you know, I'm thinking of our comrades in Massey, would be the first people to respond because they've lived it, you know, they've lived a version of it, they know, you know, passion, holding that critical lens of how easy it is, you know, when there's political will to enact change. But
we've got to find ways to, you know, tap into that, or to create the political will, don't we? And to find, you know, ways that our governments can be moved to do the right thing, you know. And it's really interesting, you know, when you speak about governments, you know, and the need sort of to respond, you know, with you know, courage, with compassion, which has been done in the case of Ukraine to some extent. But governments also need to be courageous when they're being drawn into alliances and operations that result in oppression and displacement. And really, they need to put humanity first, you know, and this is something that we have a long way to go as well, because they're often polarized and the blinkered ways of looking at things. There's also intransigence. There's also difficulties in terms of coming to common understandings as well. You mentioned language, and language is so really important when we talk about solidarity and bearing witness, creating common understandings of each other. Same for our activism. And creating spaces, and this is something that you've done so much of through your life. You know, what can we do in terms of creating spaces to get beyond anger, beyond the disagreements, beyond the difficulties, the amplification of the disagreements that ultimately end up in wars and conflicts?
I actually thought you were referring to sort of almost activist ruptures there. So I was like, but yes, in terms of war. Yeah, I mean, thinking a good dose of therapy might be useful for, but no, I'm not going to pathologize. And also, I think, you know, as somebody who's trained as a therapist, I find it a very inaccessible medium, you know, in terms of access, which when it should be a fundamental human right to be able to access it. But ideally, you know, I think I'm thinking to start with in terms of our movements, you know, I really take, I think, a source of deep hope from an emergent generation of younger activists who I think have such wisdom. And increasingly, you know, in my middle age, I'm definitely feeling the redundancy of my voice in a really healthy way, you know, like that these movements don't need interlocutors, you know, and I'm really conscious too, you know, of as a white person, you know, that most of these platforms, you know, that I occasionally speak on are not mine to occupy. And I think it's really, really important that whenever I'm diverging here, but whenever I hear sort of pejorative narratives vis-a-vis teenagers, the teenagers that I work with are amazing. And they're so, I think, in their 20s, you know, language that is not, you know, sort of gender binaried or heteronormative, you know, language that, you know, is authentically decolonialized or decolonized, you know, decolonial, you know, or practice colonial. So not just using the language, but actually looking at power and privilege, and really taking leadership, you know, because I'm thinking here specifically vis-a-vis, you know, groups like Young, Paperless and Powerful, you know, in Ireland, of undocumented youth, you know, of asylum seekers and refugees, who don't need interlocutors, you know, whose narratives and stories and lived experiences are so very, so I'd say within our movements, in terms of those repetitive cycles, I'm just thinking of sort of rupture and maybe then amplified on a more global level when we refer, not amplified as in culpability or responsibility, but in terms of dynamics. But I honestly think part of this, and it's not to simplify it, you know, to say, you know, because there's been are comparatively smaller, but share of women in power who have wielded that power in ways that are injurious to people. I'm thinking of people like Thatcher here, but I am also thinking of the huge amount of women leaders. You know, I'm thinking specifically in, you know, social movements, in NGOs and civil society groups and grassroots community organizing, that I think are negated by that ridiculous, and I know I referenced her, but I'm just referencing it to say that I think it's a ridiculous straw man that's constantly held. There needing to be, I think, a profound revolution when it comes to who's in power. And I'm thinking back to a speech that Desmond Tutu made a few years ago on International Women's Day or Trans Feminist Day, or however we frame that to make it as inclusive as possible, you know, and as invitational as possible in terms of how we think about gender. But he said basically, you know, that men have exercised enormous influence and held enormous power for far too long, and that it's women's turn. And I believe that deeply, you know, when it comes of, I think, you know, community leadership that draws upon different languages, different ways of being. And I think I'm not trying to fall into sort of reductive stereotypes of women in care, you know, or motherhood, or, you know, I'm thinking more systemically in the sense of accountability and a recognition of interconnectivity and a recognition, I think, you know, of the fallout of these policies, you know, both if we're talking about socioeconomic, if we're talking about war, etc. But yeah, basically, I'd say more women in power, but also deconstructing power structures as they presently exist, because they don't serve people. I think our form of electoral politics, depending on the context, you know, that sort of recycling from one election to another of one iteration or another of the same political parties with sometimes the same stale visions, sort of repackaged, we tweaked, retreated, you know, have very little impact again on, you know, the profound injustice of our times, the profound inequality of our times. So yeah. And also, you know, really listening to this emergent generation, you know, they're inheriting a world, you know, that we, for better or for worse, have not succeeded in translating a lot of our campaign and advocacy into tangible victories in terms of systemic change. You know, and they're going to deal with the fallout of that. So really, yeah, I think that intergenerational piece also, you know, carrying. And I think a lot of the reflections and insights and wisdom sometimes of an older generation, but really just creating space, you know, for those who come after us.
Hey. We could keep talking all night, Caoimhe.
Sure, we could. Long-winded.
I'm really enjoying this, and you know, I'd love to just go on now for another while and talk about deconstructing the power structures, bearing in mind the contexts in which we all operate as well, and you know, being mindful of that in the movements that we're part of as well, you know, and ensuring that, you know, the voices of the people who have been excluded, whether it's because of gender or some other characteristics or aspects of their identity is finished, and they are included. But you know, I think it might be a good spot to leave it with that sense of hope that you've articulated there. Is there anything else you want to add before we do finish up?
I'd say just one quote, not intended as a motivational quote, but I'm thinking just as a summation, almost Arundhati Roy's quote of that there's no such thing as the voiceless. There's either the preferably silenced or the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. And that resonates so deeply vis-a-vis, yeah, so much of voice, representation, etc. And I'd also just say, because I'm recognizing, you know, in our small, sometimes congregations of people who end up listening to these, you know, sort of online forums, just to mind yourself. Because I think oftentimes we're very good at expending a lot of energy and commitment, and just just spirit in terms of trying to accompany others. And that's super important, you know, that justice and human rights-based work. I feel if activists could internalize even a modicum of that care in terms of their own sort of inner life, it would be a very good thing as well. So yeah, just to create our own ecologies of care, sort of internally and externally, individually and collectively. And hopefully that translates then into, bigger systemic change.
Absolutely.
We live in hope.
Mind ourselves. We're not quite at the end of the journey yet, you know, when we've got peace, justice and equality for all. There's a bit further to go.
And put love tacked in there somewhere too.
And love, yes.
Nice.
Thanks so much, Caoimhe, for your time.
It's a pleasure.
And it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you this evening.
Likewise. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, John and Caoimhe. That was an excellent discussion. Very sensitive topics, and she certainly opened my eyes to a few things and made me rethink about some of my thinking on some matters. But let's hear from Mark Caravan and his response to the conversation. Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. I mean, firstly, I feel inadequate in terms of responding to that because there's so much being said there by Caoimhe, and she's such a powerful witness, and it was a very good interview as well. And also the range of themes and topics covered is very extensive. So I feel it's not possible to do justice to all that was covered there in about 5 or 7 minutes of comments. So for what is worth, and accepting that I feel unequal to the task, I actually was quite interested in how she both finished and ended. I liked the ending that reclaimed the word love, which is a word we tend to be terrified of culturally. It's so colonized, as much of our language is, and has been taken over glibly. But that is such a powerful force. And in the face of so much darkness, and indeed so much trauma, the word love and the reactivation of that experience of love is really central to the healing process. Now, I work a lot professionally in social care, and I've seen a lot of people with trauma, and some road for them back to recovery does involve an ability to make themselves vulnerable enough to love. And loving is really an important thing. So I just want to reclaim that. It's actually, strangely enough, a word that Paulo Freire was very keen on, and even went so far as to say you could not work progressively with people and do dialogue with people unless you loved humanity. And he didn't mean love in a glib sense. He meant a true, deep-rooted commitment to humanity and to human beings. Where she started was with trauma, which I think is quite an interesting way to start, because again, often in circles of people committed to human rights, we often fall into a very politicized language, and we use language that can be quite depersonalized and rather abstract to people who were actually having the experiences. And sometimes I remember speaking to an activist who was an Indigenous lady who was involved in the Dakota pipeline issue, and she said, after a few months, all the white people came to support us, all the white liberals came from the two coasts. And what we did with them is we just let them have meetings all day. And they had meetings all day and they talked all the time, whereas we continue to do our ceremonies as Indigenous people. So language can sometimes obscure. So I like rooting it in the embodied trauma that war brings about, an embodiment, an experience of trauma. And trauma, of course, the great stereotype of trauma is that it leads you to have very primal responses, the fight, flight, freeze sets of responses that we're familiar with. And I suppose we're seeing all of that in the current Ukrainian disaster. We're seeing lots of fleeing people, we're seeing fighting people, and we're seeing presumably freezing people as well in the face of overwhelming threat. Why does trauma come about? A lot of it is caused by people who impose trauma because they themselves are full of fear. They're full of fear. A key thing I think is for the traumatized person is their sense that something has happened to them or been done to them without their consent. They have not given consent. And I think we live in a world devoid of consent. It is saturated by violence in the sense that power doesn't ask consent of the powerless to act. Our earth is powerless, ground is powerless, trees are powerless, they're cut down, rivers are powerless, human beings are powerless, women are powerless, Indigenous communities are powerless, racial minorities are powerless, and they're not asked their consent. So they're inherently structurally traumatized by the imposition of force on them, which I think is endemic. And so the world is saturated in a form of violence. Wars are simply the top of the iceberg, I think, in terms of the depth of the structural violence. So recovery, which Caoimhe talked a little bit about, I think, which is our work, and I liked her concept of moral injury as well. That's a very rich idea, that the witnesses are themselves morally injured, and because we see that lack of consent, and I think lack of consent and the recognition that you live in a world where your consent sometimes and often will not count, and your body can be invaded, leaves you to be very dislocated and displaced. You may be physically where you live, but you can still be displaced in your being, in your heart, and dislocated, though you're living in your home, because it has all changed when the trauma comes, when the violence comes. And that's true of domestic abuse survivors as well as war victims, right up the whole scale. You're in at home, but you're dislocated. So how to come home? I think that's such an important project of activism, is how to come home to, and home in that full sense. I don't mean a house. I don't mean just a house. I mean to feel at home on my planet in safety and in security with my people around me who are helping me, who care for me, who listen to me. So I liked what you said about that we have to remember, and again, this is back to depoliticizing our language a bit, or perhaps more fairly saying de-jargonizing our language a bit, that resuscitating these kind of primal terms like love, care, compassion. These are really strong words. And I think 21st century politics has to be animated by that kind of language rather than old language that we used to use in the 20th century, like struggle and conflict and those kind of words, which are fine words, but they're harsh. They can be harsh as used. Reconstituting home and rootedness and bringing people back to safety, and reconstituting, to use the term joy as well, joy. And that joy is a very subversive thing. Joy is healing, and it's also a subversive response to those who do not ask my consent, that I will not lose my joy in the face of this threat. I retain my joy. I retain my right to be joyful. I give myself permission to be joyful in my communities and in my communities of celebration. I think these are very strong and subversive things, and they have a powerful motivating impact on other human beings and give that security and that comfort. And there is that strange paradox, which I've observed as well in social care students, quite a few of whom come from a trauma background, that their trauma, if they heal from it, can lead to great empathy, which is another thing you talked about, John, in your conversation, empathy. And empathy can come from the recognition that I too have had trauma, I have suffered, and so I recognize your trauma. I can reach across that trauma. I can reach across our national divisions and our racial divisions and our gender divisions in a shared understanding of trauma. And so the last thing, because I know it's 2 minutes to and I'll stop now, is this notion of being the peacemaker. I'm very keen on this idea of how to make peace in such a world of so much non-consensual trauma imposition on people. I think the peacemaker looks beyond the conflict, looks beyond the binaries, looks to the point of integration. And in that sense, the peacemaker inhabits the present, but from the place of the hopeful future. We inhabit the present, but we are trying to live and construct the future in the present. The future is the time of peace, though the present is still the time of conflict. And that is our hope, that we are inhabitants of a future yet to come, but that is coming. And I like that hopeful note. I think we've covered that quite well. I think that's as much as I can do. It's 2 minutes too, so I know you want to wrap up by 8.
Mark, that was absolutely first class. Your words were really, really beautiful. I think appreciated by everybody here. You were more than up to the task. Now we've, over the series of the 5 webinars, looked at some of the harsh realities, with Malala Joya talking about Afghanistan, Lara Marlowe talking about various places and descriptive imagery that stays with you, but finishing with the beautiful language, both yourself and John and Kiva, and the message of hope that, we're inhabiting the present to construct the future. I thought that was very, very nice. We definitely express our empathy with all the victims of war in Afghanistan in the freezing cold now, or coming from the Ukraine or wherever it is. We're against all wars. We believe they've got to go. And I guess our real parting message would be to try and don't be passive, stand up. It's important. The anti-war message is important. And even if you saw the Russian woman 2 days ago on the Russian national news channel with the no war message, her message was seen by millions of people in Russia, and she risks, many, many years in war. It's important that we stand in solidarity and empathy with our brothers and sisters around the world and try and build for the future. So we're going to finish today with Jack B. Yeats's a Jack B. Yeats painting entitled Grief. Just a 30-second reflection. It's Jack B. Yeats' most powerful expression of his abhorrence of war. It appears to originate from a sketch entitled Let There Be No More War. At the center of the painting, an apocalyptic figure on horseback gestures aggressively in the foreground. An elderly man looks on at the blood that drips onto his hands, while a mother places her arm protectively around a small child.